Hello students, this is Professor Krause again. We are into week 2 where we are thinking about the character of a pastor, more specifically their holiness. In our last lecture we looked at some of the New Testament passages that lay out for us what our lives should consist of as we strive to be holy in every aspect of our life and ministry. Today we're going to talk more practically about what we can do to guard our holiness so that we are focusing as much on hating sin, rejecting sin, pursuing righteousness as we are becoming a better preacher or caring for others. So, all right, let's open with prayer. Father, thank you for another opportunity to teach and to focus today on the important and practical issue of how we as pastors can guard our holiness. There are many things in our lives that we try to guard and protect because we know it's important. And how important is our holiness? God, we have to do better. So Lord, I pray that you'd impress upon all of our hearts, including my own, the importance of pursuing you and pursuing righteousness in everything that we do for your glory, God, but also for the good of your people, and so that the lost can see what it means to be transformed by the love of Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. All right, so if you think about our lives, every single day, you and I are faced with opportunities to either choose righteousness or sin. And the question becomes, later on today, when we are tempted to sin, will we give into that temptation? Will we, as pastors, preach and care and serve with the right attitude and the motive, or will we do it for something that's wrong? Will we seek to be holy in every single part of our lives as much as we seek to be a better preacher? We strive, you think about it, the books that we're reading and the things that we're thinking about, the conversations we're having with others, especially other pastors, typically relate to our ability to preach better and to care for others, to grow the church we're pastoring even more quickly. But when is the last time that we just really thought and prayed along the lines of, Lord, help me to be holy in everything that I do? And that is so important. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Guarding our holiness really begins with a biblical understanding of holiness. In our last lecture, we looked specifically at passages from Timothy and Titus and Peter, even considered, some of those Old Testament leaders who were set apart by God to lead Israel and to lead in holiness, and yet they failed. But before we even go deeper into living in holiness and being a holy pastor, exactly what is holiness? Well, you probably know already, to be holy means to be set apart. And when thinking about the holiness of all believers, we can simultaneously, as the Bible does, be holy because God has declared us to be holy. Positionally, God has declared us set apart to be holy. But he also calls us to be holy, right? Which seems kind of talking out both sides of your mouth. How can you be holy and yet also be called to grow in holiness? And it is because we still struggle with the flesh and with temptations, with sin. And so sanctification means that day by day we are seeking to root out sin and to replace it with the fruit of the Spirit. And that is also growing in holiness. So in a sense, the way I like to think about it is we are growing towards what God has already declared about us. We are becoming more and more like Jesus Christ and conformed into his image, which is exactly what God has already said to be true about us. So, what exactly does it mean to guard our holiness? So, what exactly does it mean to guard our holiness. 5 simple things as I was, writing this lecture and thinking about this topic. It's not exhaustive. You probably have your own that you would add, but first, I think a mindset of being proactive. Second, fight against sin. Third, be held accountable. Fourth, seek to be an example. And 5, pursue righteousness. So let's look at each of these in turn. First, be proactive. As those set apart for holiness, called to lead by example, to be holy in everything we do, to be above reproach, we are not going to be like soldiers who are caught off guard. Paul talks about in Ephesians about this spiritual battle that's going on, and we preach on it. But I wonder how many of us think as deeply as we want our people to. When I preached through Ephesians and I got to that passage about the attacks of Satan and what it means to do spiritual warfare, like I'm pleading with my people to be proactive, to put on the armor of God, explaining what that all means and why we have to be so proactive with Satan, who is, roaming around seeking those whom he can devour. But I wonder how many of us have that same urgency. Are we also preaching that to ourselves, that there is a spiritual war going on and we have to be ready? To be ready, we have to be proactive. And I think that means more than anything for us is guarding our hearts and minds. There are dangers everywhere. Satan wants to destroy us, our ministry, and we cannot afford just to sit around. We have to be proactive. We have to guard our hearts from anything that might steal our love for God and ministry. So if we find something that's just becoming too wonderful to us, something that's causing us to love God less or causing us to love something more, then we have to protect our hearts from that. We have to not put things before us. And thinking about our mind, things that we're going to hear, things that we're going to see that are going to be wrong, that are going to lead us into sin. We have to proactively cut that stuff out, not put ourselves in situations. And that's where the be proactive comes in, right? If we're not proactive, then we're going to find ourselves in those very compromising situations. And maybe we're not going to give in this time or that time. But when it comes down to it, eventually we're going to continue to put ourselves in a position where we're going to be forced to make a decision about temptation, and we're eventually going to fail. So we have to proactively guard our mind and our heart so that we are aware of the dangers, what tempts us, where we're going to fall, and protect ourselves from that. We have to proactively cut out any temptation to sin as much as possible. If we know that being in front of a laptop at super late at night is going to be a temptation, then we've got to cut that out. If we know that doing something is going to lead us into anger, we've got to cut that out. Be proactive. We've got to fight sin. We have to have such a distaste and hatred for sin, knowing that sin will destroy us. It's not that, I'm saved now, so I'm safe. No, we have to ask God for a hatred of sin, so that just the thought of returning to that life that we used to live just makes us want to vomit. We have to hate sin, fight sin, kill sin. As John Owen famously says, be killing sin or it'll be killing you, right? It's one or the other. We can't just sit back and hope when it comes down to it that we're going to make the right decision. We have to fight against sin. And that goes into knowing ourselves. We know ourselves better than others know us. And so rather than being proactive, rather than being passive, and allowing Satan to lead us into sin and our flesh to lead us into sin over and over, we must fight against sin. And whenever we see sin growing in our hearts or our minds, we have to fight against it and put it to death. We have to be held accountable. It's so sad to hear of so many pastors being disqualified from ministry due to failures in their holiness. And it's even sadder to me when I learned that these pastors were not held accountable. I can only imagine that going in at some point in their lives when they were pastoring, probably when they first started out, they were held accountable. But as they grew in fame or they grew in experience, they began to think that they do not need to be held accountable, that they're safe, they're okay, or that being held accountable would not would restrict them in some way. Please be held accountable. Don't do ministry alone. Do not surround yourself with other pastors or deacons that are yes people, that will allow you to get away, that will allow you to go off on your own and do ministry on your own. Give others that you trust the ability to speak into your lives, to ask you tough questions. When they do, be honest, be held accountable. Enough's enough. We have to be able for others to hold us to the same standard of holiness that we're seeking to hold others to. And that begins with just honestly confessing our sin and allowing others to be there close to us, to hold them accountable as we hold them accountable. I think this is simple. But I threw this in there. Seek to be an example. Like, when I see myself in a certain way, it causes me want to be better. I'm daily reminded of my responsibility to be a good example to my children. I'm not always. But knowing that they are watching me and my actions, not just in terms of holiness, but everything I do, whether it's being, eating right or doing exercise or reading, the things that I think are important, especially holiness. They're watching me, and my actions and my words influence them. And so I want to strive to be a good example. And I think that extra bit of motivation, that others are watching me. And when it's all said and done, I want to be an example. I want others to say, as Philip is pursuing Christ, I want to pursue and live the same way that he's living. So with the gospel as our motivation and the building up of our other people, we're supposed to be an example. That's our responsibility as pastors, to set an example that others can follow. We must strive to be an example of holiness for others. Help your people to know, number one, you're not perfect, but number two, you're striving to be conformed in the image of Christ in everything that you do. So that you can say to people, yes, I fail too. And when I do, I confess my sin and I get back into the fight and seek to strive to be holy and to be like Christ in everything, and invite people to do that. Actually hold people to biblical standards of holiness. Paul talks about judging the church, and not with a judgmental attitude the way most people think about it, but if we all held each other to the standards and we encouraged each other and picked each other up, I think the church would look so different. We have to be willing as pastors to even admit our failures and to admit our weaknesses without glorifying them. Like, we don't want our sermons to be 50% us talking about our sin and where we've fallen, but we have to be willing to say, I sin too, and this is how I've sinned, and I'm grateful for God's mercy. We have to be able to do that. That's part of being an example. Emphasizing that God calls all of us to be holy. Every single one of us, even the new Christian, you are called to be holy. And then invite others to see how you live. If we lock ourselves away in an ivory tower, then as much as we talk about being an example or living in holiness, no one can see our lives. But if we are doing life with others and we are there on the ground with others and they see us and they see our struggles, they see that we fail, but they also see that we live in light of the gospel, it can be a game changer. Finally, pursue righteousness. Pursue righteousness, the way I think about pursuing holiness and the importance of pursuing righteousness is like 2 steps: cutting out sin, replacing with righteousness. I always use this example for our people because it's so perfect for understanding what we're seeking to do, not only as pastors, but as all Christians who are striving to be holy. Every time you mow your yard, if you see a big, huge patch of weeds and you go over that weed with your lawnmower, what's going to happen in a week? Well, those weeds are going to be just as high, maybe even higher. And that's the way we do sin a lot. We cut down sin. We see sin, we hear a good sermon, and we feel convicted, and so we try to mow over that sin. And what happens is, if we don't deal with it rightly, a biblical way of thinking about sin, then we try to cut out sin, but we keep on coming back to it eventually. It just keeps on growing back. But it's almost like cutting out sin, as in like cutting it out completely, digging it up and replacing it with grass. Right, that's how you deal with weeds. If you want to deal it completely, you kill the weeds, replace it with grass that's going to grow. And so, striving to be holy for us as pastors, when we recognize, anger or pride in our hearts, we're not just trying to mow it down. We're trying to replace it with, humility and peace and compassion and patience. In Philippians 4, Paul tells us to think about things that are good and right and noble, right, and pleasing to God. It's not just cutting out things that are bad, but then replacing that with thoughts of what is good and holy and righteous. Colossians 3, set your minds on things that are above, right? If one of our temptations to sin, or the ways that we sin, is living in worldliness and being, swayed by worldliness, then we need to cut that out and replace it with thoughts that are things that are above. And this can go for any type of sin, but striving to be holy and to be an example means pursuing righteousness. We're not just killing sin, but we are pursuing what is right and good in everything, so that eventually we no longer have a taste for that which is wrong anymore, because we only want to do what is right. H.B. Charles has this great line in his book called On Pastoring. I recommend it to you. Super short, very good. He says, when you think about it, years and years, really decades ago, the pastor had the best reputation in the community. He was someone that even the lost would go to and seek help from and go to for prayer. But now, pastors are seen as like used car salesmen. It's time for us to redeem the calling of pastor, and to change the way people see it and the way that people see us. That we are men of integrity, and we're not perfect, but we love others, and that we are striving that our lives, every aspect of our lives and our ministries, would look like Christ. And it's going to take work, and we're not going to change everybody's thoughts about us, but we can change the ones that matter. Even those people in our church who might distrust us because they were hurt years and years ago by someone who ignored their character. We can't afford to ignore our character because we are so focused on our competence. We need both. We need to be competent. We need to be men of character. But we can no longer focus so intently on becoming better at everything we're doing to the neglect of our character. So I pray that you would go out and strive to guard your holiness, protect your heart and mind, fight against sin, pursue righteousness, and be that example that God has called you to be. I hope this was encouraging and convicting. I pray for you as students. I pray that you'd pray for me. Praying for one another that we could live up to this. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, please feel free to leave it on the YouTube link or email me. Until next time, God bless.